There is a place in Central Africa where the maps run out. Not in the poetic sense that explorers use when they want to sound dramatic, but in the literal cartographic sense that the territory is so vast and so impenetrable and so consistently hostile to human presence that the surveys have never been completed and the data has never been gathered and the lines on the official documents represent educated guesses rather than confirmed knowledge. The Congo Basin covers an area larger than the entire western half of Europe. Within it, the Lulua swamp region of the Northern Republic of Congo extends across approximately 140,000 square kilometers of flooded forest and black water channels and floating vegetation mats so dense that from the air they look like solid ground. The canopy closes overhead with the completeness of a ceiling. The water beneath a canoe is the color of dark tea steeped too long, so opaque that a paddle disappears the instant it breaks the surface. There are no roads. There are stretches that no confirmed human expedition has ever penetrated. Satellite imagery shows green, unbroken and uniform, and tells you nothing about what moves beneath it. This is the place where the story lives. Not a story in the sense of something invented around a fire and passed down through generations of embellishment, though there are those who would describe it that way and their skepticism deserves serious engagement. A story in the sense of an accumulating body of testimony, gathered across 2 centuries from sources that had no contact with each other, describing the same animal in the same specific terms, pointing to the same stretches of water, and expressing the same particular mixture of matter-of-fact familiarity and genuine fear that people display when they are talking about something they have actually encountered rather than something they have only heard about. The animal has a name in the Lingala language of the region, Mokele-mbembe. The translation carries within it a physical description so specific that it functions almost as a field identification key. It means the one who stops the flow of rivers. Not the one who attacks canoes, not the one who lives in darkness, not the one who cannot be named. The one who stops the flow of rivers. That is a description of mass. Of an animal so large that its body displaces water at a scale that affects the movement of the river around it, that dams a channel simply by occupying it. The people who use that name live on these rivers. They know what a hippopotamus does to water and what a crocodile does to water and what a floating log does to water. They are not people who confuse one thing with another when the stakes of confusion are their own survival. The name they chose for this creature is not the name of a legend. It is the name of a physical phenomenon. The written record of European contact with this testimony begins in the 1770s, when a French missionary traveling through the basin recorded encountering enormous tracks pressed into the riverbank mud. The tracks were nearly a meter in circumference. They were spaced at intervals suggesting an animal of very large size moving with a long stride. The missionary never saw the animal that made them. He recorded the tracks not as the centerpiece of a dramatic account but almost incidentally, the way a traveler notes unusual weather, because to the people accompanying him the tracks required no explanation. They knew what made them. They had a name for it. They expressed neither surprise nor particular alarm, only the specific caution that people display around a known danger in familiar territory. The missionary wrote it down and moved on, and his account sat in archives for generations because nobody looking at it knew what to do with it. What makes that account significant is not the tracks themselves, which cannot now be verified, but the timestamp. A European observer in the 1770s, recording testimony from people who had no reason to construct a fiction for his benefit, encountered a description that matches in its essential features the descriptions that would be recorded by expedition after expedition over the following 250 years. 2.5 centuries of consistent testimony from isolated communities that had no mechanism for coordinating their accounts. That kind of consistency does not emerge from folklore alone. Folklore drifts. Stories told and retold across distances mutate in the retelling, accumulating the particular distortions that reflect the fears and values of each community that passes them along. The dragon in one valley grows a second head in the next valley and fire-breathing abilities in the valley beyond that. What the Mokele-mbembe accounts do not do is drift. The core description remains stable across communities separated by days of river travel and different languages and different cultural frameworks. That stability is either the signature of a real animal that multiple independent observers have actually seen, or it requires an explanation for why folklore in this particular instance behaves differently from folklore everywhere else, and that explanation has never been satisfactorily provided. The description itself is worth examining carefully, because the specific details are as important as the overall shape. The people of the Lulua region consistently describe an animal of approximately the same size as a forest elephant, or somewhat larger. The body is low and heavy, built for an aquatic existence, spending most of its time in the water with only the upper portions visible. The neck is long, considerably longer than the body in some accounts, held out horizontally above the water in the manner of a bird rather than raised vertically. The head is small relative to the body, described as similar in proportion to a large snake's head, tapering rather than broad. The tail is long and heavy, trailing behind the animal in the water. The legs are described as 4 in number, thick and columnar, capable of supporting the animal's weight on land, though it is rarely seen there. The skin is smooth, lacking scales in the manner of a crocodile, colored in the grayish-brown tones of the water it inhabits. This physical description, assembled from the independent testimony of dozens of witnesses across a vast geographic area, fits no animal currently acknowledged to exist in Central Africa. It does not fit the hippopotamus, which has no neck worth mentioning and a barrel body that sits high in the water rather than low. It does not fit the Nile crocodile, which is a long flat animal with a distinctive ridged back and a head that is very much not small relative to its body. It does not fit any species of large snake, because the legs are described consistently and specifically, 4 of them columnar, capable of supporting significant weight. It does not fit an elephant, which the witnesses know intimately and distinguish from this animal without any apparent confusion. What it fits, with a precision that has unsettled every biologist who has examined the testimony carefully, is the general body plan of a sauropod dinosaur. A long-necked, 4-legged, heavy-bodied herbivore of the type that the fossil record tells us dominated large portions of the Earth's landmasses for more than 150 million years before disappearing 66 million years ago. The herbivore detail is one of the most consistently reported and one of the most often overlooked aspects of the testimony. The Mokele-mbembe is not described as a predator. It does not hunt fish or attack humans for food. The witnesses describe it as a plant eater, feeding on specific riverside vegetation including a particular fruit-bearing vine and the nuts of certain palm species. They can identify the plants. They can show you the feeding sign, the stripped stems and the broken branches at the waterline. An animal of this size feeding on vegetation of this kind would leave evidence that persists between sightings, and the witnesses say that evidence exists and can be found. This is not how legends typically describe their monsters. Legends give monsters a hunger for human flesh because fear requires a personal stake. The matter-of-fact dietary specificity of the Mokele-mbembe accounts has the texture of field observation rather than mythological construction. The first systematic scientific engagement with this testimony came through a herpetologist with a career built on precisely the kind of careful methodological skepticism that makes a researcher's eventual conclusions difficult to dismiss. He did not arrive in the Congo basin as a believer seeking confirmation. He arrived as a scientist who had examined the accumulated testimony and concluded that it warranted investigation using the same methods he would apply to any other biological question. What he did in the field was not dramatic. It was methodical. He and his colleagues developed a picture card protocol that deserves significant attention because it was specifically designed to prevent the leading of witnesses. The cards included images of dozens of different animals, from every continent and every major taxonomic group. Real animals and imaginary ones. Animals native to Central Africa and animals that had never existed anywhere near it. Domestic animals and wild animals. The deck was shuffled and presented without comment, and witnesses were asked simply to identify any animals they recognized. The researchers were not looking for a specific reaction to a specific card. They were looking for what the witnesses chose spontaneously from a comprehensive array of options. And in village after village, in communities separated by days of river travel and different languages and no confirmed communication with one another, The witnesses passed over the hippopotamus card and the crocodile card and the elephant card without hesitation, identifying each of these animals correctly by their local names, demonstrating that they understood the task and were capable of accurate identification. And then they stopped at the sauropod illustration. Not with excitement. Not with the eager recognition of someone who has finally seen in a foreign picture the monster their village has been talking about for generations. With the calm identification of people pointing at something they have seen before. That one, they said. But the neck is longer than that. That one, but the skin is darker. That one, but the tail drags lower in the water. They were not agreeing with the illustration. They were correcting it, which is what people do when they have actual visual memories to compare against a representation and find the representation inadequate. The researcher in question went into those sessions expecting to find that the witnesses were describing a known animal badly, that the accumulated mystery would dissolve under direct investigation into the obvious mundane explanation that trained biologists prefer. He did not find that. He found instead that the witnesses were describing the same unknown animal consistently and specifically across distances and languages that should have produced variation if the accounts were based on shared cultural transmission rather than shared sensory experience. He came out of the field unsettled in a way that his subsequent writing makes clear. He found uncomfortable, and that he reported with the reluctant precision of a scientist who follows evidence rather than expectation. The swamp itself is an argument. This point is made less often than it deserves to be, because it requires sitting with the scale of the place in a way that is difficult to do from outside it. When skeptics ask why no specimen has ever been recovered, why no clear photograph exists, why no bone has washed out of a channel or been found on a bank, the implicit assumption is that an animal of this size in this region should be findable if it exists. That assumption is wrong in ways that become obvious only when you understand the environment. The Lulua swamp is not a lake. It is not a contained body of water with defined shores that a survey team can walk around in a reasonable period of time. It is a vast interlocking system of channels and flooded forest and floating vegetation mats covering an area in which large animals can and do exist for their entire lives without ever coming to the attention of outsiders. Forest elephants in this region are documented but rarely seen. Gorilla populations went unconfirmed in some areas until satellite tracking made it possible to locate them without direct observation. The idea that an aquatic animal adapted to deep channels and flooded forest in this environment would regularly present itself to human observers is an idea that reflects no understanding of how the place actually works. The water itself enforces invisibility. In water of this opacity, an animal the size of an elephant produces surface disturbance, a ripple, a wake, the suggestion of a back or a neck breaking the surface before submerging again. Witnesses describe exactly this. They describe seeing the animal at the surface briefly, a neck raised above the waterline, a broad back visible in a pool, a wake moving through still water with no visible cause adequate to explain its scale. They do not describe close prolonged observations in clear conditions. They describe the glimpses that the environment makes available, and those glimpses are consistent with an animal that spends most of its existence below the surface of water so dark it provides complete concealment at any depth greater than a few centimeters. There is also the cultural dimension, which functions differently from the way skeptics typically characterize it. The Mokele-mbembe is not simply a monster story. It is an organizing principle of behavior around specific stretches of water. Certain pools are forbidden. Certain channels are not fished. Certain bends in certain rivers are approached with specific protocols, particular times of day, particular sounds avoided, particular actions prohibited. This behavioral structure around an animal is not the structure of mythology. Mythology produces taboos around actions and moral categories. The behavioral structure around the Mokele-mbembe is the structure of wildlife management, the accumulated practical response of communities that have learned through experience how to coexist with a dangerous animal in shared territory. You do not develop that level of behavioral specificity around something that does not exist. The story that circulates among the river communities about the last time the animal was hunted reinforces this point in a way that is either a straightforward historical account or an extraordinarily effective cultural mechanism for ensuring that no one ever tries to hunt it again. According to this account, a group of hunters cornered the animal in a narrowing pool, killed it with spears, and following the custom of the time consumed the flesh. Every person who ate the flesh died. The account functions simultaneously as history and as prohibition, explaining both why the animal has never been successfully hunted and why no community would attempt to bring out a carcass even if they had access to one. From a purely anthropological perspective, this is a sophisticated cultural adaptation to a situation in which killing the animal produces consequences the community is not equipped to manage. From a purely zoological perspective, it is the explanation for why the most basic expectation of the skeptic, if it exists, show me a body, has never been satisfied and will not be satisfied by the communities that live alongside it. Several expeditions across the 20th century added details to the file that individually might be dismissed and collectively are more difficult to set aside. A naturalist conducting a wildlife survey in the 1980s, traveling by river through a section of the basin he expected to find entirely unremarkable, encountered a guide who refused to paddle past a particular stretch of water during the hours around dusk. The guide offered no explanation that made sense within the naturalist's framework. He simply stopped paddling and waited, and would not be argued past his refusal, and when the light changed and the hour moved past a certain point, he paddled on without comment as though nothing had happened. The naturalist recorded the incident not as evidence of anything supernatural but as evidence of a behavioral protocol around a specific location that the guide understood and was not prepared to abandon for the benefit of a foreign researcher who did not share his information about what the location contained. Other accounts describe a sound. This detail is reported less frequently than the visual descriptions but is mentioned by enough independent witnesses to warrant attention. A low resonant sound, carrying across the water after dark, not resembling the calls of any animal the local people could name from their comprehensive catalogue of the swamp's fauna. The people of the Lulua know their environment with the thoroughness of professionals whose lives depend on accurate identification of everything within it. They know what every bird sounds like and what every mammal sounds like and what crocodiles sound like and what the water sounds like when hippos move through it. When they say a sound belongs to nothing in their catalogue, they are not expressing ignorance. They are expressing the specific discomfort of experts encountering something outside their established knowledge. The reasonable scientific position, which is not the same as the popular skeptical position, is that the evidence for Mokele-mbembe is anomalous in ways that the standard dismissals do not adequately address. The standard dismissals are misidentification of known animals, shared cultural mythology, and the credulity of witnesses unfamiliar with the range of animal life. Each of these collapses under examination. The witnesses identify known animals correctly and without confusion, demonstrating that their identification of this animal as distinct from all of them is a genuine distinction rather than a failure of knowledge. The cultural mythology explanation cannot account for the stability of the description across communities isolated by language, distance, and different cultural frameworks. And the witnesses least susceptible to cultural priming, the outside researchers and missionaries and surveyors who arrived with no prior knowledge of the legend, reported encounters that were consistent with the local testimony rather than with the alternative explanations they came prepared to offer. What the evidence does not provide is a specimen. That absence is real and it matters. Testimony, however consistent and however credible, is not a confirmed biological discovery. The history of cryptozoology is populated with creatures that gathered compelling testimony and never yielded a body, and in each of those cases the accumulating silence eventually became its own answer. The honest position on Mokele-mbembe acknowledges both the genuine anomaly of the testimony and the genuine weight of that absence. It does not resolve the tension between them by choosing one side and dismissing the other. The tension is the honest position. What is changing is the environment. The Lulua swamp is not static. Logging operations have pushed access roads deeper into territory that was previously unreachable. Climate shifts are altering water levels throughout the basin, forcing animals in all the deep channels to move or adapt. The cameras that wildlife researchers now deploy on motion-triggered mounts in remote locations are reaching places that no human expedition could sustain for long enough to observe anything. The combination of shrinking wilderness and expanding technology means that whatever the next 2 decades produce in this region will be produced not by expedition members paddling into the unknown on local testimony but by instruments that have no cultural priming and no fear response and no reason to misidentify anything they record. If there is an animal in those channels, that is how we will find it. Not through another expedition pushing deeper on the strength of accounts we already have. Through the cameras left running on banks no one watches, through the acoustic monitors recording sounds across frequencies no human ear parses in real time, through the satellite systems tracking surface disturbance on water bodies too remote for regular human presence. The vault that has held this secret for 250 years of documented testimony is a vault with thinning walls. And in the meantime the witnesses keep arriving. Not in the dramatic form of a single definitive sighting that resolves everything. In the form of another fishing family on another river who describe another encounter in another forbidden pool in terms that match, once again, the terms used by the last family on the last river who were asked the same question. The description does not vary. The fear does not vary. The specific corrections made to the illustrations do not vary. Across 2 centuries and a region the size of a continent and communities with no mechanism for comparing notes, something keeps producing the same account. Something in that swamp keeps stopping the flow of rivers. What it is remains the question. But the question is not going away.